Thank you, Noel. I'm happy to be here.
Well, let's just start with today. What we're going to be looking at and learning about is understanding how to journal. Journaling can help in the post-traumatic stress disorder healing process. And I kind of wanted to start for many of our audience, our listeners. You know, we throw out these terms like PTSD, and what does that actually mean? So maybe we just start there. Give us a running definition of what is PTSD.
PTSD is a condition that is brought about by exposure to a traumatic event of some sort. In its current definition, it was related to combat trauma primarily. And after the Vietnam War, or up to the Vietnam War, the psychiatric community, the mental health community, did not acknowledge that PTSD existed. And it wasn't until 1984 that they finally wrote a definition that can be used. Reality is PTSD dates back to the earliest written history, which is the Iliad, where they talk about how Achilles was afflicted with what we now know as PTSD.
So, you know, PTSD, one of the things I'm curious to learn more about on our call today is, you know, who does it affect? What are the causes and the symptoms? How would I know that I have PTSD?
The symptoms generally fall into three separate categories: emotional, behavioral, and physical. And under the category of emotional symptoms would be things like hypervigilance, survivor guilt, and flashbacks. Behavioral symptoms might include fighting, anger management issues, and paranoia. Physical symptoms might include fatigue, an elevated heart rate, chills, shaking, and there's a list of probably 100 symptoms that are in the book, and they affect different people in different ways.
So tell me, you know, in your book you talk about a lot of different types of treatments that are out there, from therapy options all the way to talking to a counselor. I'm really interested in your kind of unique approach of journaling, and how did that come about?
Journaling came about initially for me through my own experiences. I'm of the age of most of the Vietnam vets. I didn't serve. I failed my draft physical, but very many of my friends served in Vietnam, and as they came home, I noticed changes in them that I later was able to connect to PTSD. And I spoke with them about their experiences and the effect of those experiences. And I kind of tucked that away for a number of years. When my own son went into the military, I remembered in the intervening years I had learned about journaling myself and used journaling as a tool to address some of my own issues. When my son went into the military, I said, I want you to protect yourself from PTSD, and the only way to do it is to prevent yourself from keeping all of those experiences locked into the back of your brain. And there's only two ways to do that. One is to talk about it, the other is to write about it. So each time he was deployed, I gave him a journal and I said, please write about the things that you're feeling and experiencing, and I know it's going to help. And it wasn't until 2 years after he left the military that I ever asked him if he actually did use those journals, because I wanted them to be private for him. And he actually did, and he believed very strongly that it was a big help to him.
That's great. You know, give me a 5-minute course on Journaling 101. I mean, I think we all kind of have our own ideas of what journaling looks like, but I'm just curious if you have a specific way that you recommend, especially when related to PTSD.
when I'm working with the soldiers at Fort Bragg, one of the first things that I tell them is that journaling is not just for little girls anymore. It's a very powerful tool, and the list that I referred to earlier of the symptoms, I will ask them to go through that list and check off in the book which of the symptoms they have experienced, or that people have told them that they've expressed. And once they do that bit of an exercise, which usually just takes 10 or 15 minutes, then I ask them to begin writing not about the trauma, but about the symptoms. Writing about the trauma can very often be more than a soldier is prepared to handle. The symptoms, however, are the things that are interfering with their lives. So pick a symptom. I encourage them to start wherever they like. Pick a symptom, write about it in detail, and why they think that they have to, say, hypervigilance as an example. Why do they feel a need to be hypervigilant? We know where the hypervigilance comes from. It's because they need combat. When they come home, the guys with PTSD are not able to turn that switch off. And so if they write about it and then think about those things that they've written, they'll begin to recognize that they don't need that. So the goal is to get them to drop off those symptoms one at a time. And the only way they can do it is to decide for themselves that it's no longer necessary. So we try to focus on the symptoms, and the other part that I give them for their own security, their own safety, is an assurance that they don't ever have to share that writing with me or anybody else. That it's important to get it out, but it's not necessarily as important.
That's really good. Maybe for our audience, our listeners, help maybe flesh out the idea of when and where. Like, when should they be doing this? Where should they be doing it? I don't know if there's any specifics that you'd suggest.
Well, there's not a list, but there are times when I ask them to think about when they can have some private time. If they have a spouse and children, try to talk with them ahead of time and say, I'm going to go and do this. I need some private time. Please leave me alone for 30 minutes or 40 minutes, however much time they can devote to it. And the place, we all have places that we feel secure. In the case of one soldier I worked with, it was sitting on the floor behind the couch. In some cases, it's at a desk in their home, at the library, at Starbucks. They have to pick that place. But I try to encourage them to choose that place based on not only a place where they can feel secure and feel private, but also a place they can one day walk away from, and then identify that place as a place from their past and a place that was a part of their healing.
That makes sense. You know, if someone to start this process that's dealing with PTSD, what can they expect as they begin to journal?
At the outset, they can probably expect a lot of pain. It's not an easy process. It's going to trigger memories that they've been trying to suppress. But as they write about these things, and again, this is one of the reasons that I counsel them to stay away from the trauma at the outset. If you're writing about an elevated level of fatigue, that's not necessarily going to put them back in that scary place. So as they write about these symptoms, it's going to take some time, but eventually it does give them the freedom to drop some of those symptoms from that list, and I encourage them to congratulate themselves when they get to that point and move on from there.
So when you talk about dropping the symptoms, do they ever actually move into the place of writing about the very specific trauma that they went through? Is that part of the journey, or do you keep that away from the journaling experience?
That's going to be different for each one of them. The way that PTSD affects your life is very different for every different person, but the ways that it interferes is through the symptoms. The trauma was the trigger, but now the trauma is never going to go away. That you can't unshoot a gun, and you can't reverse any of the things that happened that caused their PTSD. But that trauma, while it was a trigger, is not today the problem. The problem is the symptoms. So by focusing on the symptoms, they can take away the troubles, and eventually, if they feel like writing about the trauma, then they should. If they don't feel like writing about it, I tell them that that's okay.
Yeah. So would you say that this process of journaling is augmented with professional counseling, or is it separate to? What are some of the other modalities that you would say need to be a part of this process?
I always encourage them to maintain a relationship with their mental health providers. I'm not a mental health provider. I'm a writer. So I don't have the background to resolve some of their issues. But this will enable them to talk more clearly with their mental health provider. And again, when I teach them how to journal, I emphasize the importance of keeping it private. One of the issues I ran into early on with soldiers at Fort Bragg is that they would meet regularly with the mental health people at Womack, the hospital on Fort Bragg, and they would encourage them to journal, but they would tell them to bring the journal in at their next appointment and share it with the docs. That's a scary proposition for a lot of guys who are suffering from PTSD for a number of different reasons. I tell them that the writing is far more important than sharing or even saving. When they have to write about something that they're particularly frightened about, nervous about, I'll say, write it out in as much detail as you can, and then throw it in the fireplace. Burn it, shred it. It has value that you've written. It doesn't necessarily have to be saved in order to give you benefit.
You know, you make a really good point about that proposition of having to come in and share with their, counselor. I think, for the sake of our audience and especially the experience that I've had working with wounded warriors, and whether it be invisible or visible, this realm of PTSD, there seems to be connected with it a sense of that, you don't lack strength, right? And I think you would agree with me in terms of PTSD is not a sign of weakness. It's actually those who step into this place, it takes a lot of strength, and they come out even more resilient as they go through that process.
That's really true, and there's absolutely no correlation between strength and suffering from PTSD. And the clearest evidence of that is the fact that the PTSD doesn't surface until they leave combat.
Yeah.
They're tough people, and some of the toughest people I've ever known were broken by PTSD.
Yeah. I want to also come back to this part of when you talk about writing in the journal and it being very private. what would you say to the spouse who's connected to someone that's going through PTSD? I know that for them, a lot of times they feel like they're outside of it, and they, with good intention, they want to step in and begin to talk with them and help them walk through this process. And there's always a relational dynamic that exists there that can be tough when you're the caregiver. What would you say to the caregiver or the spouse who is in this journey along with the one that's dealing with PTSD?
What I tell the caregivers is to be patient, and what I tell the soldier is to write as much as you have to write to find some relief, and when you're ready to share, you can either use the journal that you've written in as a guide to help you through the conversation, or you could share it with your spouse, or you could use it as a reference tool and make a separate list of the things you want to share. It's important for the caregiver to know that this is a very real affliction, and it's a serious problem. When they have difficulty sharing, that's not a question of trust. It's a question of the soldier, the veteran, doesn't know how to deal with this level of pain. They don't teach it in basic training. They don't teach it in any of the schools in the military how to cope with this. So they're scared, and they're broken. So I tell the caregivers that it's very difficult. I understand how difficult it is, but give them some space. Give the spouse some space to try and find a way out. And when they do, they will share.
Okay. So you begin the process of journaling. What could someone expect in terms of results? Are we talking a couple weeks, a couple months, a couple years?
At the very least, a couple of months before they see some change. And I ask them to write regularly, and regularly is going to be different for each person. Not necessarily daily, but at least weekly, and do it whenever possible at the same time and place, so that it becomes a habit. And it'll take several months in order to see any change at all, and could very well take years. I still hear from soldiers that I counseled years ago who are feeling better but still struggling.
And this might be case by case, but when you talk about the symptoms dropping off, is there somewhat of once that begins to happen, almost like domino effect where things start to drop off very quickly, or is it one painstakingly at a time that begins to drop off?
It's going to vary depending on the symptoms and how entrenched they are. But the biggest thing that happens as they start to drop off is that the writer's confidence level comes up, and they see that this really is helping, and it doesn't have to help overnight. As long as they can see that there's a light at the end of the tunnel and it's not an oncoming train, they're going to stay with it.
Yeah. What does it look like? I guess in quotation marks, feeling better, right? I don't know if I don't think there's one answer for it all, but no. What would be maybe the picture of feeling better as they move through this process?
One of the most dominant symptoms that I see amongst the vets is what they call barricading. And that's when a guy won't come out of his house unless it's absolutely necessary. Won't go to social events, won't go to the grocery store. He feels safe in the house. And sooner or later, once they begin this process, they'll accept an invitation. And they'll go out to lunch, they'll go to a neighborhood party, whatever, something like that. And it might happen without their even thinking about it. but that's a huge milestone that very often the spouse will know first before the vet.
Well, all that we've been talking about has been documented in this book right here called The Pain of PTSD and the Healing Power of Journaling. And I can tell you that this is a wealth of information and very practical to get at the root of a very complex problem. And so, Michael, thank you for your work and your passion to help our veterans and those who are transitioning in a very difficult time in their lives. And we're gonna, if you want to get a copy of this, we're gonna have a link down below that you can go and pick this up. But I wanted to say thank you, Michael. I don't know if there's any departing comments that you'd like to share with our audience in relation to your book, or maybe anything else.
Well, one of the things that we failed to talk about is how to get the book. I think I told you when we talked earlier that it was available on Amazon. I haven't yet put that piece of it together. So if they want to buy the book online, it's available at roswellpublishing.wordpress.com. If you want to give my email address, I'm perfectly happy to respond to emails. When I'm dealing directly with a vet, there's no charge for the book. And I'd be happy to respond to anybody who requests a copy.
That's a gracious offer. And again, all that information that he just mentioned, we're going to have it on the webpage below the video here, where you can click on it and get direct contact with Michael. Michael, thanks again. I really appreciate you being on this podcast. This was